car fixed yet? It's the Studebaker. Yeah, you know, the one with the little doggy in the window that goes...
For 11 seasons, Carol Burnett gave America something it didn't know it needed. An hour of pure, unguarded laughter, built on pratfalls, parody, and a cast that seemed to genuinely adore each other. She played queens and cleaning ladies, movie stars and scorned housewives, and she did it all with the rubbery, fearless physicality that made her one of the most beloved entertainers of the 20th century. But tucked inside that 11-year run is a single half-hour that Burnett has, by her own account, never sat down and watched again. Not on its anniversary, not when it turned up on Best of Specials, not even decades later, when nostalgia might have softened the edges. To understand why, you have to go back much further than 1977, all the way to a childhood that looked nothing like a sitcom. Carol Burnett was born in San Antonio, Texas, in 1933, into a home destabilized by alcoholism on both sides. Her father struggled to keep steady work, and her mother wrote for local papers while battling her own dependency. Neither parent was able to give her the stability a child needs, and by the time she was still a small girl, her maternal grandmother had effectively become her parent instead. In the early 1940s, that grandmother moved with her to Hollywood, chasing not fame, but survival, a cheap apartment, a welfare check, and a neighborhood far removed from the glamour the city was famous for. Burnett has spoken openly over the years about how threadbare those years were, and about how the movies became her refuge. A ticket cost $0.25. Inside the theater, for 2 hours, the world was orderly and kind, even if outside it wasn't. That love of make-believe followed her to UCLA, where she enrolled hoping to study English and journalism, largely because writing had been her mother's unrealized dream. It was an elective theater course that changed the direction of her life. She discovered, almost by accident, that she could make a room of strangers laugh, really laugh, and that doing so gave her a kind of confidence she'd never had access to before. She began performing comic songs and novelty numbers at campus events, built a reputation as someone genuinely funny, rather than merely pretty or talented, and eventually made her way to New York with barely any money, and even less of a plan, determined to break into show business the hard way. The hard way is exactly what it was. She lived for a time at a boarding house for young women trying to make it in the arts, took odd jobs to cover rent, and auditioned relentlessly. Her earliest real breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a comic love song written about a stiff, humorless government official, which she performed with such commitment that it became a signature bit and opened doors to national television. Appearances on major variety and talk shows followed, and by the end of the 1950s, she'd landed a starring role in the Broadway musical Once Upon a Mattress, earning a Tony nomination and proving she could carry a show, not just steal a scene from one. Before any of that, though, came years of steady, unglamorous apprenticeship. She played small supporting parts in short-lived Broadway and off-Broadway shows through the mid-1950s, took whatever television work she could find, and slowly built a reputation among producers as a performer who was reliable, versatile, and, crucially, funny in a way that wasn't tied to any one gimmick. That reputation led to a multi-year run as a regular on a popular daytime variety program in the late 1950s and early 1960s, where she absorbed lessons in live comedy and audience rapport that would go on to define the rest of her career, including a taste for unscripted, off-the-cuff moments with an audience, which she'd later make a signature of her own show. A television special she headlined alongside Julie Andrews, built around an evening of music and comedy at a legendary New York concert hall, further proved she could anchor a major broadcast event under her own name, not just as part of someone else's ensemble. Television, though, is where she became a phenomenon. After that run co-starring on a popular daytime variety program through the early 1960s, and the well-received special alongside Andrews, CBS gave Burnett her own hour-long variety show in 1967. It was a bet that a woman could headline a network variety hour on her own terms, at a time when that format was almost exclusively hosted by men. The bet paid off spectacularly. The Carol Burnett Show ran for 11 seasons, drew tens of millions of viewers a week at its peak, and became one of the most decorated programs in the history of the format, collecting dozens of Emmy Awards across writing, choreography, and performance categories. It also became a genuine incubator for comic talent. Harvey Korman, Vicki Lawrence, Lyle Waggoner, and Tim Conway all built enduring careers out of the show's ensemble chemistry, much of which was built live, in front of a studio audience, with far less rehearsal polish than viewers assumed. Among the show's recurring bits, one of the most beloved was The Family, a sketch built around a cantankerous, working-class household presided over by a domineering mother, played by Vicki Lawrence, and her long-suffering, perpetually disappointed daughter, Eunice, played by Burnett herself. Eunice was messy and undignified in a way most of Burnett's other characters weren't. She dreamed of being special, a singer, a star, someone who mattered, and the sketch usually mined comedy out of the gap between her ambitions and her reality. Audiences loved her because she was recognizable. Underneath the wig and the flowered house dress was every person who has ever wanted more out of life than they were handed. In February of 1977, The Family took a version of that premise and pushed it somewhere darker. In the sketch, Eunice finally gets her shot at stardom by appearing as a contestant on the real-life amateur talent program The Gong Show, singing a well-known ballad about heartbreak in front of a panel of celebrity judges. It should have been another showcase for Eunice's delusion and the family's bickering. Instead, the writers let the joke curdle. The judges dismiss her. The dream she has quietly nursed her whole life collapses in front of an audience, and for a few uncomfortable seconds, the show stops asking you to laugh and simply asks you to watch a woman come apart. There was no exaggerated accent, no pratfall to release the tension, just Burnett, in character, letting genuine humiliation play across her face, while the studio audience went nearly silent. It landed. Critics and fans alike have pointed to the sketch for decades as one of the show's most emotionally ambitious moments, proof that a program built on slapstick could also handle real pathos when it wanted to. But by Burnett's own account, the reason it worked is exactly why she has avoided revisiting it. Eunice's humiliation wasn't a performance built from nothing. It was assembled, consciously or not, out of the same raw material as Burnett's own childhood. The hunger to be seen, the fear of being laughed at rather than with, the particular ache of wanting a bigger life than the one you were given. Watching herself play that back, she has suggested, means watching her own old wounds rendered in close-up, and she has simply never wanted to sit through that again. It isn't that the sketch embarrasses her professionally. By every account, it's the opposite. She's proud of it, and grateful the show was willing to attempt it. It's that revisiting it means revisiting a version of herself she'd rather leave in 1977. That instinct to protect herself from her own history runs through the rest of Burnett's life, too. Her first marriage, to fellow performer Don Soroyan, ended not long after her career began to eclipse his own struggling ambitions. Her second marriage, to television producer Joe Hamilton, produced 3 daughters and years of professional partnership, but also strained that eventually ended in divorce. The couple's oldest daughter, Carrie, developed a serious drug addiction as a teenager in the late 1970s, a crisis that played out largely outside the public eye even as Burnett's career was at its most visible. Burnett has spoken since about how agonizing it was to set boundaries with a child in crisis, and about how those years taught her that love sometimes has to look like letting someone be angry with you. Carrie eventually got sober, rebuilt a career of her own as an actress and writer, and grew close enough to her mother that the two collaborated on a stage play drawing on their shared history. Carrie's death from cancer in 2002, at only 38, was arguably the hardest loss of Burnett's life, one she has said she carries with her every day rather than one she has ever fully moved past. Around the same period, Burnett also fought a very different kind of battle. In the mid-1970s, a tabloid published a story, falsely claiming she had been drunk and disorderly in public, at a time when she had spent years speaking candidly about the alcoholism that had shaped her childhood. Rather than let it go, she sued for defamation, and the case dragged on for years before she ultimately prevailed, a rare instance of a celebrity taking a supermarket tabloid all the way through the legal system rather than absorbing the story quietly. It became something of a turning point in how aggressively public figures were willing to push back against reckless reporting. And Burnett has said since that the fight was never really about money. It was about refusing to let a lie sit unanswered, particularly a lie about the one subject that had cost her family so much. That same protectiveness resurfaced decades later, in a much more personal way. In the years after Carrie's death, one of Burnett's other daughters struggled for a long stretch with addiction of her own, cycling through treatment programs while raising a young son. When the situation became untenable, Burnett and her third husband, musician Brian Miller, whom she married in 2001, a marriage that has lasted far longer than either of her first two, stepped in to take legal custody of their grandson rather than watch him be swept into the foster system. It was, by any measure, an enormous undertaking for a couple already well into their later years, and it echoed, in its own way, the choice her own grandmother had made generations earlier, stepping into a parenting role that circumstance demanded rather than one anyone had planned for. And yet Burnett kept working and kept finding new audiences. She won an Emmy for a guest role on the sitcom Mad About You in the 1990s, returned to Broadway in a Stephen Sondheim review after a 30-year absence, and lent her voice to animated features that introduced her, all over again, to children who had never seen her original variety show. In her late 80s, she stepped into the final season of Better Call Saul, delivering a quietly devastating performance that critics called one of the show's most memorable turns, proof that her instinct for finding the human ache underneath a scene had never dulled. A few years later, in her 90s, she took a lead role in the Apple TV Plus series Palm Royale, earning an Emmy nomination and becoming, by some counts, the oldest woman ever nominated in her category. It's a career that spans nearly every era of American television, built on the willingness to look foolish, fall down, and be laughed at on purpose, which is what makes that one episode from 1977 stand apart. For an hour every week, Carol Burnett turned her own vulnerability into other people's joy. In that single sketch, for just a few minutes, the joke stopped being a gift she was giving the audience and became something closer to a mirror. 50 years on, she still doesn't need to watch the tape to know exactly what's in it.